flip side, I came home with a Nintendo Wii for my trouble, so that was fun.
I was going to say,
we were there.
A story behind that one.
Sort of. I mean, we were there doing like sort of an initial NERC-SIP. We had done the assessment, and now we were actually doing like some of the initial like mitigations for their initial NERC-SIP compliance push. And it was a team of about 4 of us from, well, what became Honeywell. We were still Matricon at the time, under Rick Kahn. And the Wii had like just come out. And at the time, Matricon was strictly a per diem based thing. So, you know, you had a flat $70 a day to use as you saw fit for food and whatever. And I mean, we were staying at the Homewood Suites, so we had breakfast and even dinner some nights, actually. I think Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, the Homewood Suites in Rock Springs at the time would do like a dinner as well as the breakfast buffet. So I did some back of the envelope math and realized that if I was willing to, and it was like we were there for 3 weeks. Like it was so much that we actually like the second weekend, we all just like left our luggage behind the counter and flew home and then came back because it was just nuts how long we were there. And we got snowed in the first weekend, so that was fun. But just did some back of the end.
It's always amazing, right?
Yeah. It's because it's like nothing, and then it's like there, but then it's like gone again because it's so damn dry that the water just like into the atmosphere, even at -20. It's hilarious. But yeah, so you know, I just did some back of the envelope math, and I'm like, okay, so I got $70 a day to spend on food. Dinner's covered Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and a Subway sandwich is real cheap. So I'll just, you know, pocket the difference for 2 weeks and go to Walmart and buy a Wii before I fly home. So I did. Welcome back to Season 3 of OT After Hours, a podcast about industrial cybersecurity, why it matters, and all of the challenges that it presents. And speaking of challenges, I really have to just single out 2026 this year as a challenging year because this is now the second time I've had to spike an episode. No June episode. I apologize for that. We did have one recorded, and then legal intervened and said, no, you can't publish that one. So, oh well. But here we are, and we're back. And it's July now, so we're going to have another go at actually recording an episode. And maybe for the rest of the year, we'll be able to keep to that once-a-month cadence. Or maybe more frequently. I don't know. Well, who knows? Getting all of us in the same room is sometimes challenging. But let's just go around the screen here, see who we've got. So we are, of course, welcoming back Mr. Tyler Bergman.
Hey, guys.
And also back with us is Zach Woltjer.
Hey, everyone.
And the ever-jovial Lance Lamont.
Hello, hello.
Good day, good day. And I continue to be Kenneth Kully, wearer of far too many hats, and we don't need to go into that right now because it's changing even as we speak, so it's all good.
It's part of the fun.
Yeah, it is. It is. I mean, I guess it's good to, you know, and I mean, Tyler, you're kind of in this situation too now because there have been some internal shakeups to the roster, and they moved me into a new role, and then I still had the old role. But then now Tyler is transitioning into the same new role, and I'll be transitioning back to just my old role. So there's like there's all this juggling going on around, and at the same time, you know, we're just trying to do our other stuff. It's interesting.
Yeah, it is, Ken, and it's. I think it's not for a lack of, you know, we don't have anything to do out there. It's just trying to kind of reshuffle the deck out there and to kind of see what fits, right? Plus, you know, we are going into the larger CPS team out there, so we're welcoming a lot of new team members and a lot of like eager, friendly faces within the Rockwell organization to learn things. So yeah, there's a lot of cool folks out here meeting up from day to day.
Yeah, and you know, we're finding some interesting skeletons buried along the way. So
always that, right?
So many skeletons.
This time we need to avoid those so legal can let us publish this one.
Yeah, well, no, we're not getting into any of that. But yeah, it's been a ride for the last month and a bit.
So I just do want to say, you know, one of the things that Rockwell prides itself on is being one of the most ethical companies, you know, winning awards on that and being recognized for that. And I have to say that being on the inside, that's definitely true. So while we might be alluding to skeletons and stuff, those are not anywhere in that to be doubted.
Yeah. Yeah, some of this stuff is like inherited from, I think, before we even got bought out. So it's, I mean, I put it under the header, and this is not a new term. I've used it on the podcast before. I've used it when Matricon was bought by Honeywell. Small company growing pains.
Oh, yeah.
Because, when you're a small, plucky company, I mean, everybody just kind of jumps in where there's any kind of aptitude or where the ask is made, as opposed to, larger companies, which very correctly perceive that, okay, all of these different functions should probably be like siloed and have dedicated staff. And even if that introduces some slowdown in terms of, interdepartmental communications and authorizations and whatever else to get something done, like it is the appropriate way to do things, because otherwise everybody just has all the spinning plates, and sometimes you lose track of whose plates are whose, and well, that's not great.
Absolutely.
Anyway, that's not what we were here to talk about. I was almost going to make this the Bob the Engineer interview episode, but I did not have time to do any sort of script writing for that, and I think I need to work on my Bob the Engineer voice a little bit first. But Tyler dropped an absolutely amazing article into our planning chat. So this is by a gentleman named Lee Carter. Does a lot of OT cybersecurity authorship, and he wrote an article on LinkedIn titled Device Hardening in OT. How far can you go before you break the plant? And what was that line you said just in the banter there before the episode started, Tyler?
So one of the things that just resonated with me when I was reading through there, and he goes on about hardening, some of the CIS controls and things of that nature. And one of the things that he leads up to that when he was talking about all these different controls out there, and he said, applying CIS level 2 blindly in OT is a fantastic way to meet your operations manager under stressful conditions. And I was like, yeah, that's about right.
Yep. It is true. And I mean, I think we've all probably got stories of, encounters, shall we say, in plant type environments where, yeah, just either something's actually broken or nearly broken, and it gets tense. It gets tense real fast.
Well, I was talking to one of our counterparts over in the software side, and they're doing things with Pharma Suite. Well, you guys may not know this or have come across it yet, but Pharma Suite is one of our kind of application suites out there that services the pharmacy side of the industry out there that does weights, measures, tracking, lot number, and all this other crazy stuff that's out there. So one of the characteristics around that is that it's very, very highly regulated, right? So you have this characteristic validation of an application platform. So everything stays the same version, whether it's like server 2000 or server 2022 or whatever it is. You see this across many other different vendors out there where it's kind of like, this is my one validated platform. We're going to build it to this spec and we're going to lock the door, and it's going to sit here and go ka-chunk, 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 doing what it's supposed to be doing out there. And we're not going to look at it again. Well, Fiber hasn't really done that, right? Where we want to poke at it and everything and make sure that it's at least up to date or to a most up to date fashion to make sure that we're doing our due diligence out there, right?
No, yeah, absolutely. And I mean, like I get the tendency to want to just fire and forget these things because, I mean, and it doesn't really matter what industry, but pharma is definitely one of those where, there's, if you think about like the typical production pipeline, and again, this is not exclusive to pharma, it's in food, it's in pulp and paper, it's in power. There's so many pieces of the process that you're controlling all along the way. And the downstream effects multiply very quickly when something upstream goes sideways.
Yeah, so it's not, stereotypical of pharma. It's across the industry with any type of OT aspect out there, right? They're expecting to just put a device in and that's going to last for the next 15 years out there, right? But as things evolved, we put OS systems out there and other things out there where, it's starting to become a little bit more reasonable level set of expectation with trying to protect some of these things, right? So can I do it directly or can I do it indirectly, right? For hardening. So
yeah. I guess but the challenge there, of course, becomes the fact that And I mean, I don't remember when I had this realization. It was years ago, but I was like mulling over in my head, like, why the heck would a control system vendor tell me that I can't install the complete suite of, available patches every Patch Tuesday onto, say, an operator's workstation? And eventually I came to the realization that it has to be the fact that the software itself is using things like API hooks in some of the ways that those patches are essentially introducing mitigations or tightening the security around things like API hooks, because malware has also used them. And it just so happens this control software is using them in a way that would also be impacted by those kinds of mitigations. And not just API hooks, other things besides, but just, actually had to like sit down and think this out for myself. Like, why the heck wouldn't you do that? Oh, right. It's because some of those same mitigations that would correctly stop malware from affecting this particular system in a particular way, given a particular vulnerability disclosure, the software must be interacting with the system in an analogous fashion, not for malicious purpose, but just, because it's necessary for as complex software as that to function in the way that it needs to. And then it's like, oh, okay, so that's why you can't just patch willy-nilly. And the same goes true for not just patching. I mean, any kind of hardening step. I mean, how many times in the last year or so have we gotten bitten in the butt by trying to do deployments to clients who are shipping pre-hardened Linux VMs?
On the same boat. And, I got to thinking about that too, especially when I was talking to some of our peers over in the Pharma Suite. You got to think about that a little bit. Like, if they did a complete design aspect out there where it's a validated design and they have certain expectations on the performance characteristics of the entire apparatus. So, say for an example, and not just Pharma, any vendor in the world out there, right? So if I do patching against this particular platform and it impacts the operational characteristic of it by just even, a few additional like nanoseconds or whatever or whatnot, does that overtly impact the entire operational aspect of it, right? So do you have to revalidate it once again on how it's doing, or recommission, or whatever you need to do out there to make sure it's like completely validated to do what it's intended to do, right? Now, I know I'm probably reaching quite a bit out there for, I don't know, I'd even go up to say 80% of the different devices out there. But when you're getting down to things that are like very micro level, as far as like motion control, things of that nature for like high speed type of processing or things of that nature, I mean, that could be impactful,
Absolutely.
Oh, for sure. Well, and I mean, You've probably seen this a lot, Lance, but like I'm thinking of, way back in my just out of university days and working IT for a crane safety systems company. And even something simple like, they actually, and I've said this again, this is another example, it keeps coming up, but it's relevant because they couldn't use the USB to serial dongles on the laptops that they were using to program some of their older safety system gear. They actually had to have dedicated laptops with onboard serial devices, or onboard DB9 serial ports, because that extra little bit of latency from the USB overhead would completely mess up communications with the device.
Oh, yes. I've seen things like that. When we were talking about taking samples, when I've done high-speed motor control, the rate at which those signals change is really, really astounding. And if you have any sort of additional delay that was not planned into the algorithms, you end up getting a totally different result, right? This value has suddenly changed by 20%. We better shut down the factory until we understand what's going on. And that could just be an additional millisecond or something like that in delay for that particular operation. So, yes, absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, again, you can't really get away from that just because of the nature and the sensitivity of these environments. Even when you're not dealing with things that are monitoring in pure real time, right? I mean, let's not even touch like the real time OS based stuff, safety systems and the like, where latency just can't exist at all. It's you need everything to keep spinning. You need all of your, whatever your ingredients to the process are, they need to be injected at the right times and at the correct intervals and in the correct quantities. And then downstream needs to pick that up and process it in the correct way, and on and on and on and on.
Absolutely.
And there's checks all along the way too, right? To make sure that, ideally there's checks all along the way too, to make sure that, you're staying within your tolerances, you're staying within your acceptable ranges. You're not, producing something where the chemical mix is off. You're not producing something where the fabric weave is off. And I mean, again, like I say, just something errors upstream and it snowballs really, really fast downstream. And at the same time, all of those constraints do exist. But Tyler mentioned this, just a little bit ago. The operational landscape has changed too. We're not just dealing with analog systems. We're not dealing with systems that are purely offline anymore. We're not dealing with systems that are running purely proprietary stuff. We're dealing with, increasingly, the same sort of hardware and software environments that are particular to IT. And again, that's not news. That's quote IT/OT convergence has been happening for longer than I've been in this industry. And it's not a surprise at this point that, okay, fine. You're running, Windows operating systems, maybe Linux. You're running Cisco switches or Palo Alto firewalls or whatever you're running. The vulnerabilities that obtain for those in the internet-facing world still obtain in the environment that you're in. And there at least has to be some thought given to whether you should do what you can to mitigate for those vulnerabilities, whether by patching as best you can or implementing other quote-unquote hardening strategies, at least as much as you can get away with given, the operational constraints that exist within your environment. But where that line is just, it can be very, in one sense, it's a very bright line, I guess, because obviously vendor says no the vendor says no, don't do it. You don't want to violate your support agreement. And on the other hand, it's not a bright line at all. It's kind of murky because even if you're operating just within the realm of, okay, this is what the vendor has approved, these sorts of changes the vendor says are okay, well, which of them is going to potentially still have an impact? I always think of RTACs, like the Schweitzer Engineering RTAC units, which, if you don't know what they are, they're essentially like a serial gateway. And typically, you'll find them in like power generation facilities. Some other facilities have them as well. But we often see them in power generation. And typically, whatever's hooked up behind them are not themselves network communicating devices. They're not capable of network communication. They only talk serial, but they're usually really, really critical to whatever the operation is, plant operations. And unfortunately, a lot of configuration changes when you have to make them in an RTAC require a complete restart of the unit, which is not great when that means that for the duration of an RTAC restart, and I don't think RTACs restart very quickly, if memory serves, whatever is behind it, you're now blind on. You can't see it. You can't communicate with it. And if you have all sorts of like fail-safes and tolerances built in, that might cause an outage, which means that if you actually need to do anything on an RTAC type unit, you're essentially waiting for a planned outage anyways before any kind of those changes can be made. Even if they're really important, even if it's actually like mitigating for some incredible vulnerability, you still have to be sensitive to the fact that making this change when the plant is running could, getting back to what, that opening quote was, lead you to have a very uncomfortable conversation with the operations manager and maybe people above the operations manager as well.
Oh, yeah. So one of the other quotes I'll throw out here too, because I thought it was kind of comical too. So it's using STIG. So a lot of those different compliance standards again, on an old HMI is a bit like fitting Formula One brakes on a mobility scooter, right? Technically impressive, operationally questionable, right? So it's kind of interesting, and I think we're kind of alluding around the fact, having the people that, recognize the larger impact items out there, right? Like you use RTAC, I'll use the ever famous like turbine controls out there, the turbine monitoring, right?
Yeah.
Like as soon as you walk into the control room, you start looking around and, what are the devices that'll impact the operation of the plant? And that's kind of what I usually kind of stop at right there. It's like, okay, where that's at, and I usually tell the rest of the team, yeah, guys, kind of stay away from that control panel over there.
Yeah, no touch.
So that I still believe to this day, and I think Lance, you had a very good one out there too. It's the stuff with consequence out there. What has real world physical consequences out here that will impact the rest of the plant? Because technically, it's all about like how do we get in here, do the stuff we need to do, and not impact the operation of the plant. That's 100% the operating ethos all day long, right?
Absolutely.
So we're talking about lifecycle servicing, right? Hardening and things of that nature, which you have to wait for your update windows and all the other crazy stuff. Sorry if I walked on you there, Lance.
No, I was just going to agree with you. I can't claim the creation of that quote. That was actually from one of my team members when I was at a previous employer. But software with consequences is a really exciting and scary place to work in.
Absolutely, every day.
Yeah, or I mean, what was our term there a few episodes ago, Zach? Crown jewels.
Wow, making me reach back to think about that one. Yeah. The crown jewels.
I mean, because at the end of the day, like, and I guess, this is maybe for practitioners in the space, like this is a really good mindset shift, maybe, is, when you're going into those facilities anew, or even if you've been in the facility for a while and you're just, continuing to work with them. And I mean, our software is definitely pivoting in this direction, has been for a while now. I think a lot of the rest of the industry, the OT cybersecurity industry, is moving in this direction as well. Talking about, this notion of risk and managing risk and calculating risk and figuring out risk. And again, whether it's like, a facility you've been in for the first time or a facility you've been in for a couple of years now, and you really have a good feel for it, like you say, those, like you say, Tyler, that control panel over there, like that's, the turbine vibration monitoring, don't touch that one, right? But equally, okay, mental note, crown jewel. That's something that we cannot afford to lose. So it can kind of, maybe you can rework your process and your approach to how you deliver cybersecurity to clients a little bit, in that, all of this kind of flows together, right? Whether you're doing the initial assessment, whether you're doing that initial asset discovery, or whether you're, managing a facility that you've been in now for a while, you'll develop very quickly that sense for, even before you've actually had a chance to sit down for that formal conversation. Okay, here's everything that you have in your plant. Like, what can you afford to lose and what can't you afford to lose? Those conversations will have already started by the time you actually get to that conversation, is what I'm trying to say here.
Hopefully. Over the last several years, we've seen a lot of things in software and et cetera, where you'll see that one. I like to think of the meme or the picture where it shows the Jenga for like the software implementations, and it shows, like the 27, different versions of software. They're all kind of leaning on one another, and all you have to do is kick out that one Jenga block, and the whole thing comes down. And
yeah.
I think about it a lot with crown jewels, because there's so many customers that I've worked with that'll go into their environment and I'll say, okay, like, what are your crown jewels? And they're like, well, everything, every asset here is, super critical, super important to the business. And I was like, okay, well, and this is where, somewhat comical and probably not overly politically correct, but, pretend everything is on fire and you're given a fire extinguisher. What's going to be the first thing that you're going to run out there and, and smother and get fixed, or whatever the case may be? What's the first, one of your firstborns that you're going to go and you're going to save? So, starting there and really getting an idea and something that you can build off of to understand what is that one block that if it gets knocked over, everything else comes with it. And understandably, it all depends on the level. That's kind of the one thing that I've realized now, especially in cyber consulting, is everybody's going to have a different lens that they're looking through. Everybody's going to have a different perception of what it is. If you ask a site manager, he's going to say maybe this line. If you ask the manager of that line, they're going to say, well, all of these assets are super critical. Everybody's going to have a different perception. And so really talking and having a conversation with each of these people at different levels it's not like a one person that knows everything. It's definitely a conversation at multiple levels to understand, okay, well, if this plant were to go down, this would really screw the business. If this line went down, that would really screw that plant. And then it all comes down to that one asset, that one Jenga piece that's holding it all together. Really starting to understand how can we differentiate that? How can we tag that as a critical asset? Because, to Tyler's point, all you have to do is just kick it the right way and suddenly your whole business is on fire. So, that's something that I've worked a lot with now with cyber consultants and understanding it and having those conversations at different levels.
And it usually falls down to that one unmanaged switch that somebody went out and bought to get the plant up and running that nobody went back to check on.
Yep, exactly. It's not broke, don't fix it.
Exactly. So I guess one of the things that Ken, that you said out there that really resonated with me is, OT cyber practitioner. Like, how are we kind of describing that these days as far as, what gives you the ability to succeed out there as an OT cybersecurity practitioner when you're talking about, OT hardening out there? Like, what are some of the journey mapping that you do out there with some of the folks out there if you're going to a plant?
Well, I was actually, that's not a bad way to pivot back to the article that kind of kicked this all off, because what I really like about sort of the back half of the article is where he actually goes through the, what does he use? He uses the CIS benchmarks, Center for Internet Security benchmarks, and he kind of goes through each of their levels and talks about the relative safety of these as they apply to the OT environment. And I mean, really, it comes down to, and again, nothing that we haven't discussed before, having that institutional knowledge, that inside knowledge of not just OT in and of itself, but of things like, this standard or that standard, and like, what are the easy wins? What are the things that are relatively safe to apply? Where are the risks of moving ahead with any kind of cybersecurity mitigations or hardening or patching or whatever? Being really, really cognizant and sensitive to, and able to speak in the language of the plant personnel to, communicate to them. I do understand like the concerns, the risks, the things that we absolutely want to avoid, the things that we are trying to correct for as we go. Just the last thing you want to be is the naive outsider. You want to be somebody who, even though you are coming in from the outside into this environment, whatever it might be, you want to be able to speak to them in essentially their language. You want to be able to speak to them in terms of their control system and the sensitivities of their process and the cautions that need to be taken when any kind of attempt at hardening is made on their environment.
Absolutely. So, I think it's, like you said, that institutional knowledge, walking into a plant and seeing that Windows XP machine for what it is and what utility provides that plant, instead of just saying like, well, why are you guys still using Windows XP, right?
It's probably a very good reason why they're using Windows XP.
There is, entirely. So it is a lot of the institutional knowledge. I'm not going to lay any doubt at that out there for anybody. And I think I always get a lot of that question out there too, is like, what do I do to kind of break into like OT cyber? Well, if you're already doing some cyber out there, like in an IT space, you're already somewhat there, but you need to gain a lot more of new respect for some of the OT devices out there. And why are some of those things become a necessity, even though like on the other side of the camp, it would have been looked upon as like, why are we still using this? Why can't you just get rid of it? Well, we've been down this path multiple different times. I don't have to reiterate, that one XP box defers like a multi-million-dollar plan upgrade a lot of times what it comes down into. So, but that is the landscape, right?
Exactly.
But, on the flip side is, the SCADA server doesn't need Candy Crush on it either. So, I mean, that's something you can easily get rid of,
Right. Well, and I mean, that's kind of, again, that's in Lee's article here, right? He's approaching it with almost a low-hanging fruit. And again, he's going through the CIS levels. But, like he talks about CIS level 1, says this is reasonably safe for most environments. You can usually implement it on just about, and a CIS is mainly focused, like at least as he's describing its application, he's mainly focusing on the anything running on OS, right? So HMIs, historians, workstations, servers, etc. There's usually, in a lot of these environments, there are some baseline things you can do. Even if it is a Windows XP box, there are some baseline steps you can take to provide yourself with a little more security than you have right now. And maybe that'll have to be good enough. And then there's sort of additional hardening upstream, because ideally your plant is not sitting open on the internet. If it is, maybe that's a good first step to maybe not have it do that. But assuming your plant isn't sitting open on the internet, even if it does have to go through some layers, like even if there is some in and out through different layers of the network, you can still, again, there's usually some basic steps that you can take within the environment, like, getting rid of spurious software that has accumulated over time. Some steps you can take that will give you a little more security than you have right now. And then further up the chain, at those other levels that you have to pass through before you're down within your plant environment, maybe you can do more there. I know I've heard this called like the caramel strategy, harder shell, gooey inside, but sometimes that's the best that you can really shoot for in a particularly sensitive environment, or in an environment with a lot of legacy stuff, or an environment where, there's just not really a lot of tolerance for downtime.
Yeah, and to be fair, that's a lot of the first easy button out there for a lot of our customers, right? It's like, okay, let's shut down any type of outside access to all these components that are sitting over here, because they really shouldn't be reaching out, right? That's one of those first step types of things. Can you sit at the DCS console and get out on the internet? Yes, bad thing, right?
Yeah.
Or potential bad things could happen, right? What it usually equates to, right? So there is a lot of really, not even really novel first steps you can do out there in a lot of these environments. Is just kind of like, this is kind of the playlist you should go by, instead of some of the stereotypical like IT standards that we see out there for like CIS controls, level 1, level 2, STIG, and all those other ones that are out there, right? And a lot of times these OT systems is trying to start with those basics. Like let's shut down access to the internet on the SCADA server here, right? Because not necessarily we need to have anybody have an internet access on the SCADA server, or no, you need to uninstall Doom from the SCADA server as well, buddy. No more of that. So I think that's kind of trying to make the distinction out there of what's good and practical for your OT space, and then where can you go too much where you can start breaking the plant, right? And I guess if everybody else is wondering about the article we're quoting out here, it's a leak harder, device hardening OT. How far can you go before you break the plant? So that
I'll make sure there's a link in the show notes.
Really flows into it. How far can we go before you break the plant? There's a lot of ways you could break the plant, right?
Yeah. Well, and I mean, in the article, like he goes on to basically point out that, okay, CIS level 1, fine, that's great. If you try and go to CIS level 2, like that's where the mitigations that you're introducing are now going to risk breaking legacy software or disabling protocols that you need for communication, or impede your authentication. And it's one of those, and again, it's that question of, okay, cool, there's some like basic low-hanging fruit mitigations you can take. They'll give you a little more security with not a lot of risk attached to them. But if you do want to start taking those stronger steps, and I mean, it could even be something like, what's limiting your OPC port range, right? Like there are, at least it used to be the case that there were some hardening guidelines which would recommend that, right? So, instead of allowing OPC to talk on the entire ephemeral port range, you constrict it to, a narrower range within the environment. That's great if you can get away with doing it, but it kind of requires all the different pieces of that particular communications chain to be able to play along. And It only takes one component within that communications chain not playing along to all of a sudden potentially risk you ending up in a situation where communication stops. So, it's one of those, proceed cautiously. And it's the same, again, he goes on in the article to say things like the Microsoft security baselines. And I think that might actually be the one where I'm thinking of, where it talks about, we used to talk about limiting things like DCOM ports, not just OPC, but like DCOM in general. And again, if your DCOM configuration is, shall we say, a little legacy, good luck. That might not work well for you. Disabling SMB is a really, really good idea from just about every cybersecurity standpoint imaginable, especially interzone SMB. But could there be something in the plant that depends on it? Well, if you don't know for sure, tread carefully, because turning it off is a surefire way to find out under, shall we say, stressful conditions.
Absolutely. So I think we went around the bus here a lot to say, you really need to know a little bit about your environment and what are some of the underlying operational items before you start doing the hardening. It's not really for the faint of heart, and probably the biggest guidance I could give out there for anybody that is looking to do OT hardening out there is making sure you know the environment, know the protocols used, maybe do some port captures out there for the traffic analysis and things of that nature to be able to see what's going on. Then from that, you can start whittling away out there of what you could maybe potentially start locking down. Firewall rules are always good. Switch ACLs are always good, so you can kind of mitigate some of that cross-population traffic out there that could be potential out there. Vendor access is a big one that's out there as well too, that can come into play. And trying to come up with different policies for vendor access, USB control, things of that nature out there too, are a lot of big things. And it's kind of knowing the nature of the beast of your operation out there. What are some of the necessary requirements and what are some controls we can put in place that are not like super crippling to the operational aspect of the thing. Let's not put 25 characters on the SCADA server for just the operator personnel to get into, type of things.
Yeah. Or, don't implement auto screen locking on your operator workstations, at least until you've had a chance to really, really assess for whether that's operationally feasible, for lack of a better way of putting it.
Yeah, your operator screen is going to lock after 3 minutes of inactivity, and then they've got to enter in like a 25-character password in MFA before they can get back into it.
Meanwhile, the alarms are blaring because something's overpressuring, and whoops.
Bob can't remember his 25-character password.
Yeah, well, that's because that's
Friday.
Yeah, well, he changed it last Friday, but also Steve was the last guy logged in, and Bob doesn't realize that it's Steve's username. So he's trying his password, but it's against Steve's account, and he's tried it 9 times. He tries it a 10th time. He knows he typed it right, but now Steve's locked out.
And the sticky note fell off the monitor.
Yes. Yeah.
I feel like we just unpacked a heck of a lot in the last minute there, guys.
Yeah, well, I mean, and that's the other thing too, is that it's, sometimes it's not even like the technical part. Sometimes it's the actual, like, it's the people part. And it's like, picture any of the like discourse on insert social media network of choice here, about like, Gen Z versus boomer approaches to technology usage. Like those, and yeah, I mean, social media obviously exaggerates those well past the point of even comedy. Oftentimes into the realms of overt cruelty, but there are within the stereotypes and the memes kernels of truth about just the different approaches, some generational, some just interpersonal, that differing groups have to technology and their sort of different understandings of how the technology works. It's all well and good to be the plucky, bright, even if you are like really OT savvy, plant IT guy, plant IT OT guy, whatever your title is. It's all well and good to be that real like technical savvy person who can just come in and implement all this stuff in a way that is safe, quote unquote, for OT, but is the plant operator who's like 20 years older than you and eventually finished high school before landing this plant job and has kind of just stuck with it ever since and doesn't really get computers except, insofar as, well, if that thing turns from green to red, then I click here. And if that thing turns from red to green, then we're good again. And I mean, I realize I'm kind of talking down here myself. I know plant operators, there's a lot more nuance to what they do. There's a lot of complexity in that job, but it's a very sort of siloed complexity, right? Like they get their control system and they get the operations of the plant. But if you ask them to run IP config, they're not going to know the first thing about what you're talking about. So these are not the same world. Yeah, these are not people from the same world, and they're not speaking really the same language, or at least they're not using the same language the same way.
Like there's a mini series here, the OK Boomer Plant Operator series,
Okay, Bob.
I don't know why that just popped into my brain. I was just sitting there thinking that. But yeah, I mean, it's common out there, right? A lot of these plant operators are just there to maintain the system. That you come in here with all this new flashy stuff and everything like that. You're like, okay, I'm here to run the plant, buddy.
Yeah,
I get it. I can appreciate that too.
Yeah, but then you do encounter these situations where something changed, something else changed, and now even though the changes themselves weren't harmful, even though the changes themselves were arguably, objectively good changes to have made, they've combined they can combine in certain scenarios in ways that are not helpful, in ways that could actually pose their own kind of risk. So it's, additional challenges. And yes, everything that, I was just riffing on there with like the password and stuff, like that's all, I've seen that live. Like I was not making that up off the top of my head. I was just synthesizing 3 or 4 things I've seen in real life. Because it's out there.
Very much so. So we'll have to tune in next time for Electrician Bob, see what he thinks.
Yeah. There's more fodder for the interview idea. Yeah. Oh man. Yeah.
I feel like we've got a list of compounding questions for Electrician Bob that we have to ask him. So we got to make that happen,
Yeah.
And it's like, what do you think about some of this newfangled technology out there? He's just out here swapping out like controller cards and things of that nature and making sure that, wires aren't shorting out somewhere.
If I flip it off and I flip it back on again, does it break?
Yeah.
Exactly.
Oh, yeah. Well, okay. Let's try and end on a half all right note. And again, Lee at the end of his article here goes on to some, what usually works. And some of his suggestions, I mean, these are, again, the sort of the easy stuff, right? Removing unnecessary services and applications, right? Obviously, if Candy Crush is installed, don't need it on there. Get it out of there. There are certain OS services that are usually on by default that you can disable. You don't usually need Bluetooth in a plant environment. You don't usually need the Xbox services in a plant environment. If you can go with application whitelisting, great. Although that is definitely more of a lift to set up, right? The disabling services, less of a lift. If you have somebody who's reasonably competent with a group policy, you can do it fleet-wide with relatively little additional configuration. But even if you have to go workstation to workstation, disabling services is usually not a huge lift, whereas whitelisting, allow listing, whatever we call it these days, is much more of a lift, even if you are just using sort of the inbuilt Microsoft Defender controls. You can do more logging, possibly, especially if you have a solution like SecureOT in place to collect and aggregate logs and then somewhere to, look for particular things and maybe generate alerts on them if they happen. There are usually some steps that you can take to reduce the efficacy of scripting-based attacks on systems. And maybe that's it. And maybe it just has to be okay that that's it. because once you get into, again, disabling DCOM, adding extra endpoint protection, the Linux-based hardening that has bitten us in the butt a few times, disabling SMB. It's not that you absolutely cannot do these things, but the risk factor of implementing these changes is significantly higher because there could be especially legacy things that depend on them. Even something like SMB, Lee points out that disabling SMB1, usually okay. But if you have those XP boxes, maybe not, especially if they need to move files around at all. And then beyond that, again, moving upstream a little bit, right? You can use, firewall, even enabling like local firewalls to the degree that you can. More on Linux, I think, probably than on Windows. The Windows host-based firewall can sometimes cause issues. Sometimes it's okay. File integrity monitoring, although again, that's a bit more of a lift to actually really implement, but it actually is a pretty good practice if you can get into it, because that would be one of those indicators of compromise that you would want to watch for in a control system. But yeah, the main thing, and I mean, Lee concludes it kind of here as well, is, look to your network, right? Your OT environment is what it is. You do what you can within that environment, and then the network around it, and especially as many network layers as exist between it and the actual wide open internet, dial up every control you can, because now you're further removed from the process. Now you're further removed from causing an upstream effect that has massive downstream effects. You're kind of just letting that be what it is, but then you're building a better shell around it. And again, yeah, caramel, I said caramel earlier, harder shell, GUI center, but sometimes that's just what you have to be okay with. And sometimes that's what management has to be okay with too, because everything else means downtime and lost dollars.
Yeah, every bit as much out there. So, at the end of the day, I think it's all about, knowing your ecosystem, know what you can change, know what's, potentially harmful for your environments out there, and try not to take on more risk than what the business unit has the appetite for, right? Big thing out there too.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm going to say that's it for this month, because I think we all have the rest of our Mondays to get on with. So you have been listening to OT After Hours, a podcast about industrial cybersecurity, why it matters, and all the challenges that it presents. Please do share our episodes with your friends, your family, your colleagues, and anyone else you think would be interested in industrial cybersecurity. And please consider leaving us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or Podchaser or wherever you get your podcasts. This podcast has been produced by me, Kenneth Kully. Our opening and closing music is by the ever-so-talented Octo Sound. Look him up if you need some music for a podcast or a video. Thank you, Tyler. Thank you, Zach. Thank you, Lance. And thank you out there for listening. We will talk to you soon.